Hi, everyone. My name is Kara Dansky, and I'm the president of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International. Welcome to this discussion on the importance of the clarity of language in discussing matters of sex and gender. And I'm very excited for our discussion tonight. We have with us today Libby Emmons and Elizabeth Miller, and Mary Lou Singleton will be joining us shortly. And I wanted to ground the discussion by mentioning that I think many of us who are active in the fight to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls have evolved in terms of our use of language. I know that I have personally. I think that when I first started getting involved in this kind of work around 2014, 2015, I probably used language that I would never even consider using today. And I think that the topic of how many of us evolve over time in our use of language and talking about matters of sex and gender is a really interesting conversation to have. And I'm thinking that we'll touch on that a little bit during today's conversation. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the fight to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls is that in order to function effectively in general, a society needs to have shared definitions of what words mean. And if we don't have shared definitions of what words mean, then we need to have the space to work it out. For example, if I ask someone, are you going on an airplane tomorrow? In order to answer that question, the person has to know what an airplane is, and the person and I have to have a shared understanding of what that is. And if the person, if I have in mind what we know to be a train, but I use the word airplane, and the person responds actually factually talking about an airplane, there's going to be some confusion. And I think our society runs headlong into this when talking about matters of sex and gender, because words like trans, transgender, gender identity, and similar kinds of language are rarely, if ever, defined with any kind of coherence or in any way that could help us get to a shared understanding of what we as a society mean by all of these things. So I think that both of these things are very interesting and fruitful, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm going to invite both Libby and Elizabeth to turn on their video. And how this will go is basically, I'm going to ask both Libby and Elizabeth to say a few things about where they are right now in the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls in terms of what they're doing and their work, their very important work on this topic. And also to just say a few things about their own evolution and journey in terms of the use of language and what that has been like personally and for the purposes of furthering their work in the movement. And then I will ask a series of questions of both Libby and Elizabeth, and we'll go through them. And it's intended to be a very informal conversation. And I want Elizabeth and Libby to feel free to jump in and interrupt me and interrupt each other. And if there's disagreement, let's have that disagreement. And if there's confusion or a lack of shared understanding of what words mean, let's tease that out. Let's go ahead and do this. This is a great opportunity to do that if we do have any confusion or lack of agreement about what words mean. So let's get started with Libby. Libby, we're so happy to have you here. Why don't you just say a few things about where you're positioned in the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls, and say a few things about your thoughts on language and over the years that you've been working on this.
My name's Libby Emmons. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Post Millennial. We are a breaking news and culture outlet, and I cover an awful lot of gender stories, gender issues. We have Mia Ashton is writing with us, and she is a Canadian mom who's very dedicated to this work as well. So in terms of language, I started out as a playwright. I was writing plays in theater. I was producing plays. I had a feminist theater collective, and I was dedicated to making space in New York theater for women to express their stories, for women characters. You know, all of my plays, for the most part, except for a couple, centered on women characters and like creating stories that were about women, about women's journeys and their lives. So language about women has always been sort of at the forefront of what I've been doing as a writer. I came into conflict with feminism when feminism decided that it was that men could be women. We came headlong into conflict, and there were some other issues as well where I was just like, that's not the project of feminism. But with this one specifically, I ran into trouble with my theater company. And we eventually, I got kicked out and we disbanded. But yeah, so at the time when I was doing that work, I was writing about how men are not women. I was writing about this, and it was turning into a big problem. I sort of staked a claim to that area of discourse, and I feel very lucky that I get to continue working on it and continue fighting this stuff. One thing that really stunned me and started me looking at this stuff was the emergence of trans in theater, and how the granting opportunities that had been specifically for women playwrights started to become for women and women identified playwrights. And I was like, wait a second. So there's the men's categories for granting, because we all know that like men were getting all of the grants. That's why there were women's grants. And now men can get women's grants. And I was like, it's hard enough to get grants as a woman writer to write stories about women, about moms, about girls growing up. And now they're taking, that money is being prioritized for men who want to discuss their female journey. Like totally unacceptable. And these granting organizations with funding from the NEA and like everybody amazing and all of this money and the Carnegie and whatever else, suddenly like women don't get priority over telling their own stories. That's so bonkers. So that's how I started. I started just wanting to be and being an artist, telling women's stories, and now I'm telling the stories of women being erased from culture, from motherhood, and from femininity at large.
Thanks, Libby, and special thanks for your work at the Post Millennial.
Thanks.
You're doing such an immense service to women and girls for getting that out there. Elizabeth, share a little bit about your story. I know you've got a book out not too long ago. If you could tell us a little bit about that and about your own journey or evolution with respect to your use of language around topics of sex and gender.
Sure. Well, my name is Elizabeth Miller, and I'm just an ordinary, everyday radical feminist living in the Midwest. I'm on the left. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I think it's important to say that, because one bad use of language around this whole thing is that people constantly say that anybody who doesn't accept trans ideology is on the far right. And I'm definitely the exact opposite of the far right. I am sort of a grassroots radical feminist activist. I just sort of try to do projects that amplify women's voices and that give women places to speak about things that are, speak their truth and speak truth to power, and keep putting accurate statements and information into the world to try to sort of counteract the barrage and tidal wave of lies that are just constantly thrown at us by everybody, including, sadly, the mainstream and left-wing press. I mean, I've always loved the New York Times until the last few years, when they have started just constantly lying about the trans ideology and what it is. And it's been such a horrifying experience to see, institutions that I have admired all my life just betray us and become liars. It's Orwellian, really. I mean, I've really spent the last few years feeling like I was living in the novel 1984. you're right. I published a book last year. This is one of the projects I did. It's called Spinning and Weaving: Radical Feminism for the 21st Century. I self-published it. It's about almost 800 pages long, and it's an anthology of radical feminist discourse and analysis from, I think, about 40 women all over the globe. I reached out to a lot of radical feminists that I knew around the world and asked them to contribute to the book. And the book has 8 parts. You can look at spinningandweaving.org. That's the website for the book, if you want to look at the table of contents. So I won't tell you what all of the 8 parts are, but they're all about various different topics within radical feminist political theory. And one of the subjects, or one of the parts of the book, is transgender politics and the men's sexual rights movement. And that part of the book, I would say, is maybe the one that's most focused on language, and most focused on how the trans movement has made inroads into eroding women's rights, largely through their inaccurate use of language. That's been kind of their key to getting in and taking rights away from women. Other things I do, I yell at people online a lot. I have a Facebook group and a Facebook page called Radical Feminism Resources, where I try to share, sort of similarly to the project of my book, I try to share information from everywhere about things that relate to topics in radical feminism. And I try to bring information to people because I hope, this might be sort of Don Quixote-esque of me tilting at windmills, but I hope that if we keep giving people good information loudly enough and often enough, it will get through to some people. And I think it does. I mean, I think, people are, or at least a lot of people are, basically rational and basically want to be decent people who don't, take other people's rights away. And so I like to believe that most people who are acting to harm women are doing it out of ignorance more than out of, worse motivations, and that if we share enough information with them, they will come to understand how harmful the trans movement is. And yeah, I guess that's my intro. That's long enough for an intro.
Great. No, that's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I think the question of yelling at people on social media combined with the question of how we use language is a really interesting one, right? Because as many of us probably know, right, Meghan Murphy got her Twitter ban for referring to a man as him, right? Posey Parker got her Twitter ban for criticizing a woman who brought her son overseas to be castrated, and she didn't hold back in language, and Twitter got her for it. So let's explore all of these things in this conversation. So I will jump in with a question, and I'll start this time with Elizabeth. What harm do you see, or harms do you see, in using terms that come out of gender identity ideology? For example, phrases like trans people, or words like transition, or a phrase like identifies as, or any other examples that you may have that you might want to talk about. What harms do you see in using these kinds of terms?
Well, it's interesting. You sent us these questions ahead of time, and I actually made some notes. And so I'm wondering how long of an answer you'd like on that, because I actually have a list I made. So it'd probably take me 2 or 3 minutes to go through it.
Oh, why don't you give us 2 or 3 harms, and then we'll go to
Okay.
she can agree or disagree, and we can have a discussion.
Sounds good. Well, I think the one that really maybe bothers me the most, because it underlies all the other harms and leads to all the other harms, is that when an ideology asks people to say things that are inaccurate and that aren't true, it grooms the public into accepting lies as being equal to truth. and to accepting that facts are whatever the loudest or most intimidating people say they are, as opposed to the actual underlying facts. And being forced to use inaccurate language also prevents us from actually stating the truth, because you have to use accurate language in order to be able to say true things. It means that when we use language that isn't accurate, or that is that are euphemisms that cover up the underlying truth, or that replace the underlying truth, it means that there are points we can't even make because we're prevented from using the language that we need to use to make those points.
Can we
So it basically prevents us from.
Let me pause right there for a second, because I think that's a really interesting point. If we're using language that obscures the truth, I think this is what I heard you say. If we're using language that obscures the truth, it makes it impossible to make points that we want to make. Is that basically what you said? Okay, could you give us an example?
There's so many good examples of that one.
It's hard. Yeah. What do you have one off the top of your head? I would have trouble like picking out one, I think.
Yeah. Top surgery.
Yes. Yes.
Say more
Yeah.
about
Is actually a horror. I mean, this is a horror. We've heard so much testimony from women who have gone through this and come out the other side butchered, that they really miss their bodies, that they're never going to be able to nurse their children. You say top surgery and it sounds like flashy and fun, but what it really is the butchery of your body and the removal of necessary body parts so that you can have as many options in life as you want. You know, I was there was a woman I was talking to at a party who had gone through this and came out the other side, and she was wearing false breasts because she was just she wanted the appearance, that womanly appearance, and she couldn't have it.
okay.
Sort of, that's devastating. That's top surgery. What do you like?
Yeah.
Bottom surgery, you know?
Right.
So
Yeah,
many
I actually have, I made a note on this actually, that takes off from what you're saying. One of the things I was thinking about is that using these pseudo words enables trans ideologists to erase the reality of how negative these things really are, and enables them to repackage what are actually dystopian horrors as being normal things. And this helps the public accept the horrors as normal. So like you said, amputating young women's healthy breasts becomes top surgery. Eugenicizing young lesbians so that they superficially appear male and are called men and are no longer lesbians, so they're erased as lesbians, that becomes transition.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the destruction of the lesbian in society, but we call it transition. People who don't perform sexual stereotypes get repackaged as being non-binary. And that sends the message that there are just a few special people who don't perform sexual stereotypes.
Yes, that's a super good point.
Yeah, and that in turn sends the message that the vast majority of people do fit into one of the buckets of sexual stereotypes or the other bucket. And it also sends the message that the vast majority of people should fit in one of those buckets.
Right, and also it says that if you're a woman who is not performing femininity properly, then you're not really a woman, which is just madness.
And it also gives, by giving just a few people like a visa to get out of one or the other of the buckets, it sends the message that everybody else should be in the buckets. And that only if you're very special do you deserve a visa out, because you're not
right. So if you're not non-binary, you better slap on some foundation and heels.
Slap on some makeup and heels.
You know, you better do it. You better be cold in the wintertime because you don't want your coat to obscure your outfit. Yeah, the whole thing.
I'm going to hit pause on this really lively discussion, which is really great. I want to invite Mary Lou to introduce yourself. Mary Lou, thanks so much for joining us. I think we had some time zone confusion or something.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. Not a problem at all. The way that Elizabeth and Libby both introduced themselves was just to sort of situate themselves in terms of where they are today in the movement to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls, and say anything, if you'd like, about your own evolution in terms of using language. And I will just say, Mary Lou comes to us with I think is an extremely valuable personal experience and perspective, having struggled with language in the midwifery community. And I'm hoping she can bring some insight in terms of her experience
Oh,
there.
interesting.
And then we can go back to the very riveting conversation that Libby and Elizabeth were having. But go ahead, Mary Lou, please introduce yourself and just nothing fancy or formal, just a minute and a half or something.
America. That was presented to the Midwives Alliance of North America in 2015, protesting the erasure of words woman and mother from the core competency guidelines for midwives in the United States. I practice mostly primary care now, and I do womb to tomb service, and I see my families that I work with struggling with the encroachment of gender identity into every aspect of their children's lives, especially through the school system. But even the homeschooling parents are seeing it in all of the extracurricular activities, the drama groups, the even gymnastics, other sports, that this is just coming in everywhere. So I continue to feel a sense of urgency around this issue and do everything I can to be clear with language and to fight for the rights of women and children.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou. Everyone, the reason I turned off my video is I noticed that my Wi-Fi was going in and out, and so it's a little bit stronger if my video is off. So I'm here and I'm happy to continue to facilitate this discussion, but I will keep my video off for now. So Mary Lou, we were talking about the questions that were sent around, and the first question is, what harm do you see in using terms that come out of gender identity ideology? And Elizabeth was making some really interesting points about how if we use euphemisms, then first of all, we can't really talk about what's actually going on. And second of all, the use of euphemisms obscures the horrors of what we're seeing. And Libby brought up the example of quote unquote top surgery. And the reality that means cutting off women's healthy breast tissue. And, I think Elizabeth's point, I think Elizabeth was sort of making 2 points, one of which is, first of all, if we use words like top surgery, no one really has any idea the reality of what we're talking about. And then the follow-up point to that is, in addition, that obscures the harm of what is actually going on. So any one of you jump in.
Actual people.
I think that I see this infantilization happening around this issue, and that people are really maintaining like ignorance around what's really happening in the medical field to children who are transitioning, even to adults who are being medically transitioned. I don't even like using the word transition though, because I don't believe it's possible to transition from male to female. And I guess, again, I just like ran in the room after clinic, so I'm trying to get my mind straight a little bit. But for me, that's one place I'm trying to find better language for myself of how to describe the medicalized process of giving cross-sex hormones and surgery to a person to create the appearance of becoming the opposite sex. I don't even like to use the word transition anymore, because
I think appearance makes a lot of sense. Like the idea is that, and this is something that I've done in articles, is I've talked about like, using Rachel Levine as an example. There's ways that I'll always refer to Levine, like Biden's trans diversity hire, which I think it's important to point that out. Like, this is the reason this person was hired, despite their total failures in Pennsylvania when they were, when he was running the health department there. Like, he did a very bad job. you know, or talking, making sure that whenever I talk about Levine, I talk about how he fathered children and had like a, you know, a heterosexual marriage, and is now trying to deprive children of having the opportunity to father children or mother children themselves, you know, and you know, I'll often say how it was done to Susie Green's son, you know, the now disgraced former Mermaid's head, because I think Green stepped down last week. I'll say, you know, took her child to Thailand for surgery to give male genitals the appearance of female. I think that makes sense
Yeah.
to do it that way. That's what it's as accurate as you can get. That is
Right.
what is happening. You know, it's about the person shapeshifter who was recently testifying in Florida, testifying that he had no functionality to the appearance of a vaginal opening.
Well, I would argue there's never any functionality.
Right, but it was like
terms-
an inch. It was like an inch. Yeah.
Mhm. In terms of being like a penis receptacle, there was no functionality, but that right.
Yeah.
It's so hard for people to define reality and discuss our reality as a sexually dimorphic species. I really try hard with my patients to say, you know, this is a man who claims to be one or a girl, you know, really are very clear about not using terms like T or what girl pills.
Right. Oh.
I won't even use the term birth control pills, because I think that calling the very strong hormones that are given as contraceptives just the pill or birth control pills, even that is normalizing this endocrine disruption, induced endocrine disruption that we've become so used to in our culture. And we need to back away from that and start saying that, you know, we're giving people estrogen and progesterone to induce temporary infertility in this person.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember being essentially put on birth control when I was 16 without really having any understanding of what it was, before I was sexually active, and without having any real understanding of what it was. And I didn't go off it until my early 30s. And I had no idea what it was actually doing to my body or to my mind. Like when I went off it, it was like a total rush. I was like, oh, I've been suppressing my personality also. You know, it was crazy. It was just crazy.
Right.
Yeah. We don't tell girls what's going on in their bodies. And so then they choose to try and turn it all off.
And the difference in the question of, you know, would you like to take birth control or be on birth control versus do you consent to being temporarily sterilized with very strong hormones?
Yeah.
It's totally different question.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think it's really important that we keep using these accurately descriptive terms instead of the euphemisms. The sad part is that the euphemisms tend to be much shorter. Like it takes much longer to say, you know, disrupt your endocrine system and temporarily sterilize yourself, but that is what's happening. And I think you're absolutely right that we have to, you know, the only way out of this is to enable people to see what's actually going on. And so that's one of the many reasons, like, I won't use the term trans woman ever, because both parts of that are wrong. They're not women, they're not any kind of women. And there's no such thing as trans. You can't change sex, and gender isn't a thing other than stereotypes. So there's nothing to trans across. And so I always say,
yeah. No, go ahead.
say men, you know, I'll just say men, or I'll say men pretending to be women, or men who identify as women, or men claiming to be women, or men live action role playing as women.
LARPing as women.
Yeah,
Mhm.
men LARPing
That's
as
great.
women.
There's an issue though, that I've experienced as a journalist, which is that a lot of times you cannot use the truthful terminology because the media and social media enterprises have been so incredibly corrupted by these lies. So,
Let me pause here, Libby, just for 1 second, because I actually,
go ahead.
no, I actually wanted to use that as a segue into precisely that. And I wanted to ask you specifically, because I know from talking with you and from other journalists, this is a real struggle. And some of it comes down to like AP style guide issues, and some of it comes down to individual publication guidelines. And you were sharing something earlier about the Canadian laws to which you are subjected. So yeah, I really wanted to ask you about how first of all, how does it work in reporting for the post-millennial in your use of language? And also, do you ever feel challenged to, do you feel challenged to use language that you don't personally want to use because it goes against your own values?
I did when I first started out, actually, and it's sort of interesting. It is publication by publication. Like, if you write for the Federalist, which I've written for the Federalist many times, and they have a great editorial team, they will not allow you to use the fake pronouns, right? So if you're right, and I'm just going to keep on Levine as an example because it's so rich with ridiculous. But if you're writing about Rachel Levine, you'll use the words Rachel Levine, but throughout it will be him and his, and he and man, right? Because that's how the Federalist does it. And I have the utmost respect for that. If you're writing for the Post-Millennial, which is a publication based in Canada and is therefore subjected to Canadian hate speech laws, of which misgendering is hate speech in Canada, you can get dragged before a human rights tribunal for that. Like, you had Jessica Levine, who I don't know what happened to this poor fellow who underwent castration and posted the gruesome infected photographs on Twitter. I mean, just
Sorry,
horror show.
Who is this? Who is Jessica Levine?
Megan Murphy kicked off Twitter in 2018. So
Oh,
Yaniv,
gotcha.
what?
Okay. Yep. No,
Yeah.
I understand.
Or
Yep.
if I
He was
may quote,
the ball
that's
waxing
him.
guy.
Yep.
The ball waxing guy. He
Yes.
managed to get immigrant women who barely spoke English dragged before the Human Rights Tribunal because they refused to wax his balls in their homes.
Yeah.
And this was effective. I mean, eventually, he wasn't successful. But it was years of dragging these women through hell, disrupting their businesses and their lives. So yeah, so Canada is its own special version of thought police and language police. And there are rules. We can't misgender in articles. And misgendering itself is a euphemism for truth, right? Like, you're not allowed to say the truth in articles because of Canadian hate speech laws. So that should go on your list, Elizabeth, in addition to top surgery.
Yeah, you can't misgender because there's no such thing as gender.
Mhm.
So you can't falsely attribute a fake thing to somebody because the thing doesn't exist in the first place.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, so one thing that I tend to do is I will use the person's last name repeatedly and to absurdity. So I won't ever use the wrong pronoun. I won't ever use, the right pronoun either. I just continuously use the person's last name. And I've gotten into arguments with editors about this. I run content, but like, I still have a boss, I have a couple. So I'm always like, guys, we're doing it my way. I try anyway. But they'll be like, this sounds ridiculous. And I'm like, yeah, it sounds ridiculous. You bet. You bet it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous on purpose. And when you look at a lot of publications like the LA Times or the New York Times, and they go along with this total nonsense, you can't even read the article because it's confusing as to what's going on. She raped a woman in a prison cell. Well,
with her penis.
Mhm.
How the
Yeah,
hell
those
did she
are
do
penis.
that? Like, how did she do all kinds of crazy stuff. Ray, I think, and lipstick and
Mhm.
special foundation. It's ridiculous. Um, yeah, so it's tough. And then of course, so that's one piece of it. And then you have the social media companies and the search engines that will suppress you and censor you, and the biggest one of all, demonetize you. And if you get demonetized, then like if the post millennial gets demonetized, I don't get to write this kind of content anymore. And maybe I lose my job. So for getting us in that position. So you have to be careful in order to continue speaking truth. And that's tough. I'm reminded of Tolstoy, who wrote a book called What is Art? And back in Russia under censorship and everything like that. So he wrote this book, and in the introduction, eventually it came out way later in English. It was translated. I don't remember exactly the process, but anyway, he talks about how the book was censored, and he says, it went to the publisher and it was fine, and the publisher sent it to the censors, which was the standard procedure, and the censors came back and said, hey, could you just make this little change? And he said, yeah, okay, I'll make that little change. And then it was another change, and then it was another change, and then it was the removal of concepts of Christianity entirely. And then it was, and he was writing about art. Like, you can't write about the history of art without writing about Christian motifs. Like, it's a huge part. That's Renaissance painting. Like, that's what that is. That's medieval painting. That's Russian iconography. Like, it's all over the place. Anyways, he says eventually the book was censored to the point where it was put out with his name on it, espousing concepts and ideas that he not only did not believe in, but was adamantly opposed to. And this is how the book went out. And that's what's happening to us. We have to fight really hard to tell the truth in a way that it is understandable. And we have to dig into these other articles that are like, she raped her with her penis. We have to really try. And there was a while where I was getting into an argument with one of my other editors about trans woman. And I was saying, it's one word. If we're going to use it, it's one word. And he was saying, no, it's not one word, because the activists get mad if it's one word, because it's like a modifier on woman. And I'm like, well, it's its own stupid thing that, it's its own garbage terminology. And it turned out that, like, if we put trans woman as one word, yeah, she got him pregnant, says the chat. That's really funny. If we put trans woman as one word on Twitter, we get told we have to delete it. We get our account locked. Jordan Peterson got his account locked for saying Ellen Page. He said Ellen Page and got his account locked for referring to an actress by her given name. So it's definitely hard, and we have to, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, not at all. I just want to pause real quick to tell participants, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A, and I will monitor the Q&A. And we're going to end right at the top of the hour. I don't want to interrupt this conversation at all, which is fascinating. But I'm sure the panelists would all be very happy to take questions. So please put them in the Q&A rather than chat. Go ahead, go back, because Libby, what you're saying is so interesting in terms of Tolstoy and
yeah, I love Tolstoy.
his work being censored out of comprehension. Like,
yeah, and that's what happens. That's what happens here. And so I've had other editors who've gone through my work at different publications and changed all of the last names that I use as sort of my way of, the reason I do that is a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is because it's ridiculous. Like, you read the article and you just read the same last name over and over and over again, and it's almost like, you definitely have to start questioning, why does it say the same last name over and over again? Why are there no pronouns? Why is this? And so what I'm trying to say when I put in the last name over and over is, one, I'm not going to say your stupid pronouns. Two, I'm just going to refer to you by your name, and that's it. That's your name. Three, you can't slam me for not, censors, you cannot slam me for not using the person's pronouns, because I use their actual name, and that's acceptable. And then the last reason is that I want the reader to wonder why I couldn't just tell the truth. I want them to think about that.
Absolutely.
I
think that I want to put in a big plug for anyone who's listening. The last time we had a language webinar, there was a question that came up that said, like, how do I refer to my coworkers in the third person without running afoul of employment policy? And I just want to put in a big plug for what Libby's saying right now, because I once wrote a very long piece about Chase Strangio at the ACLU, who probably many of us have heard of. Chase is a female, Chase is a woman who's an attorney at the ACLU, and her birth name's Kate, but she goes by Chase. And I wrote a really long piece about Chase, and every time I referred to her in the third person, I just used the name Chase. And it is awkward. It is very awkward for the reader. And I wanted readers to think, why is Kara just using the name Chase over and over again? I won't do it for men. I won't refer to Charles Clymer as Charlotte. I won't do that.
No.
I'll just refer to
No,
him.
I would refer to Clymer.
Yeah.
Clymer.
Refer to, Clymer. And I use last names.
Yeah.
It is, language creates our reality, right? Like that's this is the battlefield. This is the place. I'm really glad to hear that we're all in consensus that we can't give in here. From the, you can't, once you've conceded the pronoun, you've conceded everything, right?
Yes, because it's a lies first off.
Exactly. And then if we're talking about people living under the Soviets, I would recommend everybody read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's "Live Not by Lies" essay, which addresses, it could exactly be written for this issue. And it's such a beautiful essay where he says, do not repeat the lie. Like, we will not live by lies. And that's what I tell families who are struggling with this, who ask what to do. It's like, live not by lies. Read this essay for strength. They were living under worse conditions than we are. As terrible as this seems, it's nothing compared to Soviet level repression that was happening then. And you just have to be firm that we're not going to repeat the lies. It gets really difficult though, like what I see coming into medicine, where now I have to check boxes for patients of gender assigned at birth. And they've even changed it from sex assigned at birth to gender assigned at birth. And one form I got recently, it's like idiocracy level right now of how crazy people are going. One form for an infant was gender assigned at birth, and the two options were XX and XY.
Whoa.
Oh, wow.
That's ludicrous.
And this is happening. These are people with MDs writing this. These are people who have 12 years of higher education.
Here's my question. How are chromosomes assigned?
How are chromosomes assigned? Well, absolutely. But if I'm like filling out this form for the state, I don't have anyone to ask that, right? So
it's just ridiculous. Like, whoever wrote that form, like, how do they have brain cells? Like, how could you imagine that?
Everyone's going insane, and we're all so busy, and we're all so burned out, and we all have a million fires to put out all day long. Most people don't have energy for this fight. Like, I talk to women in the medical field every day who are like, thanks for speaking up. I wish I had any energy for that. I'm just so busy. People are just so completely exhausted by the reality we're living in that most people don't have the space to fight. But usually when I get things like that, I will, if it's not an electronic form, which most of them are these days, I'll actually write under it sex, male or female. But when it's an electronic form, there's no option to do that.
I remember when
I want to hit pause. Mary Lou, that is fascinating and upsetting. And yeah, the fact that there's no way to answer questions electronically without capitulating to the nonsense language is infinitely frustrating. The reason I'm jumping in is there's a question for Elizabeth in the Q&A,
Okay.
and then we'll go on. And the question is, I think it relates to a point that Mary Lou was making, which has to do with the importance of accuracy in language, with which I think we all agree. And then Elizabeth made the point that often accurate language is longer and more cumbersome than the gender jargon. So the question is, for Elizabeth, is there ever a time you would use a transgenderist term for the purposes, for the purpose of either clarity or brevity?
I can't think of any time I would be willing to do that. I would definitely try never to do that, because I don't like to be made to lie. I don't like to be made to state things that aren't true. I think I think it hurts me as a person to be forced to lie. And I think that if I capitulate to a demand to lie, I'm hurting society. And so, I mean, I can't think of a situation where I would willingly use inaccurate language, either for brevity or clarity. And I mean, I think the trans language is almost never clearer. It's almost always obfuscatory rather than clarifying. If somebody has a question about like what I'm referring to, I'll clarify what I'm referring to. Like if someone says, oh, well, are you talking about a trans woman or something like that? I would say, I'm talking about a man who you would call a trans woman. Yes, I am talking about a man who says he is a woman, but I don't use the word trans woman because men can't become women and people can't change sex. So I would try to just always be accurate. And if I needed to clarify, I would clarify by explaining rather than by using the inaccurate language, which
Well, that's
never
another issue.
anyway.
That's another issue with the trans language, right? Another issue with it is it's really confusing. It's on purposely, it's very purposely confusing. But when you think about trans woman, you have to like make a whole bunch of connections in your head. Like a trans woman is a man who is appearing as a woman. Like you have to go through that whole thing, before you can understand what it is that you're talking about.
Yeah. Which leads me to another thing that I thought of when I was answering these questions, which is that the whole project and necessity of using this fake inaccurate language, it takes us away from talking about the things that we actually want to talk about. Like we spend all our time just dealing with this nonsense. And it means that we never get to talk about women's actual rights or needs or what's being taken away from us or how we're being harmed, because we're so busy, talking about, men and their fetishes and, where the spaces that they're trying to get into. So our attention is constantly being taken away from the things that we actually want to talk about. And that's, I think, another really big harm from, this whole...
I strongly suspect that might be the point.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like we never get to talk about domestic violence.
Right, exactly. Or rape or, anything else.
I strongly suspect that is exactly the point. They
Definitely.
didn't like it that second wave feminism succeeded in so many ways.
Yep.
And this is part of the backlash. Pornography is part of the backlash. Prostitution and legalized sex trafficking is part of the backlash, and trans is part of the backlash.
And surrogacy too, like
Surrogacy.
turning women's bodies into rental wombs,
Mm-hmm.
destroying families, destroying women. What?
They're all different sides of the same coin, which I guess the coin has like 5 sides, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, but it does make sense. Yeah, they're all different sides of the same die. How about that?
That's much better.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, question for all of you. And also I want to continue to encourage attendees to put questions in the Q&A.
Oh, that's a good point somebody just made in the chat.
What was that?
Domestic violence.
Yeah.
Domestic violence is another euphemism. It's actually, it is male violence against women. And we're trained to say domestic violence, but yeah, I mean, there are women who abuse kids for sure, but it's not as gender-based violence. That's even worse.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not gender-based,
Canada.
it's sex-based.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it only goes in one direction for most of the time. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not both sexes doing it to each other equally.
No,
No.
I mean, you have women abusing children, like women, you know, being violent to their kids. But that's child abuse. That's
Yeah, that's not
a
usually
different
sex-based.
thing.
Yeah.
No, then domestic violence that's men beating up women mostly.
Yep. Or murdering.
Yeah, all of it, really. Beating them up
Okay.
is the first step. Yeah.
So question for you all. Gender identity ideology is purported to be centered on kindness and respect, but the general response to any questioning of it has resulted in rape and death threats by trans activists. Why doesn't their public use of violent, misogynistic language why doesn't their public use of violent, misogynistic language and actions, I'm going to add, in light of recent events, discredit their supposed aims?
Because they say it doesn't happen. They again use the language to make up falsehoods and lie about it. So what's happened is you have the whole trans activist crowd with their cronies in social media, with the recent exception of Twitter, and corporate media outlets. They have come out and told us that words are violence, that language is violence, and they tell us that actual violence is not violence. And they've been doing this. It's not just in this space, but in other spaces. If you guys remember, in 2020, there were riots in a bunch of cities in the US, including in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? And so you had CNN's Oscar Jimenez, I'm pretty sure it was Oscar Jimenez, out there in Kenosha reporting live, standing in front of a building that was on fire, like flames shooting out of it, no fire department, no firefighters or fire vehicles in sight. And Jimenez said live on CNN that the riots were fiery, but mostly peaceful.
Mhm.
That's a lie. If it's arson, then it's not peaceful because it's arson, and that's destruction by fire. That's not peaceful, but he said it, and CNN was roasted for it. He was roasted for it, but we still have to keep bringing it up because they still tell us that words are violence and that violence is not actually violence. Look at the whole situation with Boston Children's Hospital and Boston Children's Hospital. Libs of TikTok comes out, right? Chaya Raichik, who doesn't write really in her own words at all. She comes out, she says, here's a video, a promotional video for child gender services from Boston Children's Hospital, and she posts it. Here is a promo video from Boston Children's for their gender services. Then everyone says that that's hateful. She took their advertising and amplified their advertising to an audience that hadn't seen it, right? And that was called hateful. They paid a ton of money. Boston Children's Hospital paid a ton of money, some film crew and advertisers, to make this promo video. They got the doctors in there. They wrote the script. They picked out everybody's outfits. They put in the titles. They did all of that. And then they say it's hateful because it was amplified. They said it was violence because Chaya amplified it on Twitter. And then the next thing you know, they're saying that because she posted that video, that was threatening against the doctors who were cutting the breasts off children. They just totally made this up. This is a garbage narrative. It's fake. It's a lie. And, they did that on purpose. And so then when you have Kara out there and, Lear Keith in Oakland saying, hey, this homicidal maniac should not, who murdered a lesbian couple and their son, should not be in a women's prison. The women were attacked. It was the women that were attacked, right? Attacked with actual violence. And that gets covered up. No one, we covered that Redux covered that, like we put it out there. Redux is a great site if you guys know Redux.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks so
It's
much,
all,
Libby. Really, thank you. I just want to note, we're gonna do our best to keep to our time and respect everyone's time and end at the top of the hour. Go ahead, Mary Lou, and then I'm just gonna ask all three of you to share some closing thoughts.
I think that, I agree with everything Libby said. And I also think it's a really old issue that women are blamed for male violence. And I would say, going back to the Garden of Eden's story, women get blamed for everything. But, it's certainly not new to this issue to blame a battered woman for provoking a violent man. The dynamic of "see what you made me do" is just being replicated in this issue. And I see many leftists and liberals, women included, who bring that like unapologetically, would be like, well, if you would just be nice, these, trans women wouldn't be threatening to rape and hurt you. And it's just the exact same dynamic you find in evangelical churches that say, well, he'll stop beating you if you submit to him. Right.
Mhm.
So this is an old problem. This is just a reiteration of the same old patriarchal sexist problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're just getting beaten up with our own compassion.
Mhm.
Okay. Final thoughts, and then we're gonna close. Let's go, Libby, Elizabeth, Mary Lou. Final thoughts.
I think it's just so important to teach your children the truth. Make sure that they know what's real, and don't let them get. I have a son, and don't let them believe lies. Truth about everything. Just always truth. As soon as they ask you a question, tell the truth. I think that's a huge part of this, is that we've just coddled the next generation into believing lies across the board in so many ways.
Thanks, Libby. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I want to sign off by just pointing out a couple of really important areas of life where this inaccuracy has huge impacts, which are law and medicine are the ones I'm thinking of. So in medicine, if you go into a hospital and you tell them your gender identity instead of your sex, it's going to mean that they're not going to be able to treat you properly, because heart attack symptoms are different in women. The way medicine works is different in women. Tests, when you get lab tests back, they should be read differently for men and women. So you could actually die if someone is diagnosing you on the basis of your gender identity instead of your sex in the hospital. And in law, like with the Equality Act, the proposed Equality Act, where they redefined the word sex to include gender identity, what that means is that there are no longer any legal rights for women based on sex, because gender identity doesn't mean anything. And so if you redefine sex to mean something that has no meaning, then you rob half the population of their legal rights. So this has extremely wide-ranging implications.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Mary Lou, do you want to close us out?
Yes, I'm going to say that I believe most people agree with us on this issue, and that most people are fed up with this. I think we're in the majority now, and we're so much stronger in terms of a movement than we were when I started turning on to this issue back in, the early 2010s, where literally the only voices I could find were Kathy Brennan and Bev Joe, right? Like there was nothing out there. We are so much stronger now. People are hungry for the truth. People want to discuss this issue. So talk about it, really be truthful with everyone. Bring it up. I find when I talk about it now, as compared to even 5 years ago, 3 years ago, people want to discuss it. They're fed up. They're tired of being driven mad by this. They're tired of the gaslighting. And our strength is we have the truth, and that's a hot commodity. So I know it's hard and it takes courage, but it's so much easier now than it was 10 years ago. And just, be truthful. Talk about it
We lost
We
Kara.
lost Kara.
Oh,
Maybe her internet cut out.
Sorry,
Oh, no.
sorry. My internet is, my Wi-Fi is
are you
very,
back?
I'm
Yeah.
back. But Mary Lou, thank you. I think that is an absolutely fantastic way to end this discussion. Thanks to all three of you. Thanks to everyone who was here. This recording will be up on YouTube. Let's keep having the conversation. Thanks to everyone from Women's Declaration International US Chapter. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Kara.
Thank you, Kara.
Bye.